Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me for the today's live stream. We're back on kind of a regular Tuesday schedule, I hope. And we are a week out from technically election night, although in Washington state there's no such thing. We're in election month, and the reality is that it's taken us a little while to get here. Since I last did a live stream last week, which I did shortly after the election, since that time we've counted another 1.1 million ballots in Washington state. So a lot of the elections have either tightened up or clarified as to the final result. And so this is really the first live stream. I've been kind of prepping some videos I'm going to be doing about the election results, and I plan on filming those tomorrow and hopefully getting them out pretty quickly. But today's an Ask Me Anything video. We got a lot of stuff we can talk about on these election results. A couple of things just real quick I wanted to get started here. Thursday, I know, I mentioned occasionally letting people know. I've been just getting inundated with a lot of requests to travel around the state and make presentations. If some of you saw Brandy Cruz, I did an interview with her on Friday, and I think she launched that over the weekend. That was actually a long-form interview, and I really appreciate, there's not very many people that do long-form podcast interviews like that, so that was fun, and I was glad that I was able to at least get something out there. I was venting a little bit in that interview. If you look at it, you'll see me discuss probably some of the same topics that we'll be discussing tonight. I know I'm doing an interview on KGMI Radio up in Bellingham Saturday morning, and another one on Spokane radio station on Sunday. And then also I'll be out on Monday. I'll be speaking at lunch at the Bothell, kind of North King County Republican Women's Club, meeting up at Kenmore Lanes. And I believe that starts actually at around 11:30 there. And I'm even kind of planning to be in the Wenatchee area during the HROC, House Republican Organizing Committee, kind of this legislative leadership vetting session. It's always kind of interesting to kind of be a fly on the wall there to whatever degree you can. A lot of them are behind closed doors, but I might just be hanging out there in Wenatchee seeing what's going on. I'm kind of curious about it. So there's a number of and then I just keep getting lots more requests. So I anticipate that if you want me to come out and speak to your group, just send me a message. Let me know which group you want me to come and speak to. I do travel all over the state. I anticipate being in Bellingham and Spokane and the Tri-Cities area in the next month or so, certainly before Christmas. So in all these areas, I anticipate being out there making presentations, taking questions, and attempting to answer them, kind of like I do in the live stream here, but just in person, which I think is a little bit more interesting in many ways. So just a quick reminder to some of the people who haven't done too many of these live streams here. Basically, you're going to see comments down below. When those comments pop up, that's basically the one that you see on the screen that I'm going to be trying to answer while I'm responding to the question. And it doesn't mean I'll stay on topic. I do try to do that as best I can, but if I try to do that just so you can kind of see what question I'm trying to ask. If you have a question for me, try to hit the @WeTheGoverned and make sure you put it in over here in the column section next. It should, I don't know, it depends what type of screen you have, but you should see it next to the video right here. Type in your questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Also, I know last time we had one person to ask a ton of questions. Thunderstriker 303, yes, that's you I'm talking about. And people were getting frustrated that I was only answering your questions because you had put a bunch of them in there. And I'm not sure if you're going to do that today, but I'm going to have to skip around a little bit just so that I can make sure everybody gets their questions answered, or at least I do the best I can trying to answer the questions that you send to me. If you're asking me questions that have been already asked, I might kind of skip through your question a little bit just because I am trying to get to a variety of questions and not just spend the whole time kind of repeating myself too much. Anyway, so that's my rough update as far as where we're going to start with the question and answer. I had a couple of things that I wanted to get into during this session tonight. And one of them is just going to be talking about what are the impacts that the Trump administration can actually directly have on Washington State, really just based on some of the policy reform suggestions that they brought up and just a couple other issues. And I want to talk about a couple of these things, these topics today, because I don't think they've been adequately covered anywhere really in Washington State. I'm going to go through a couple of them. I guarantee nobody else is really talking about them, at least to the same degree that I am. And so I'm definitely open to your insights and suggestions and comments and questions and all that good stuff. It's okay if you want to make commentary back and forth in the comment section. It's harder for me to find the questions. I'll do my best to do that as we go along here. But the first question kind of leads into this core topic that I wanted to make sure I covered tonight. So let me just jump to it. And this first question is right here from Deborah McClory, and I'm going to pull it up here on my screen as well. And the question is, what do you think Ferguson will try to do to stop the Trump Agenda 47 in Washington State? And examples are deportations, education, federal funding cuts for schools, teaching gender identity and critical race issues, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a good question. I mean, one of the things that, of course, Ferguson, who was pretty much the Attorney General, unique in modern Washington State history, who did everything he could to ignore violent crime and just let it basically exists unfettered in our state with no restraint from his office. But by God, he definitely spent his time focused on filing lots of lawsuits during the Trump administration. And even when the Biden administration would do the same thing, he simply would ignore it and just let it go. It was super partisan, very absurd. He dedicated a vast amount of resources at the Attorney General's office, which just has its largest law firm in Washington State. They have too many attorneys, and Ferguson definitely was very good at wasting most of their time on just going after these frivolous kind of trivial litigation against Trump. Most of it was quite pointless, and he lost a lot more than he represented. What was funny is he would do press releases whenever he won a hearing or some minor motion, and then when he would lose, you wouldn't get a press release out of the AG's office at all. It was so typical of Ferguson. He's such a phony. But anyway, so you had the fake guy pretend like, and then of course suddenly he realized that his history of being so pro-crime was not a good thing for him, so he suddenly turned over a new leaf, and at the last minute, over the last 6-7 months, got a what looked like to me about a $30 million campaign that he ran in order to pretend like he cared about law enforcement and public safety for the first time in his political career. So that was kind of an interesting example. So the question, of course, is that Ferguson immediately after being elected got Nick Brown, who was the recently elected Attorney General, to do this joint press conference. And remember, Nick Brown's kind of like this follower that Ferguson appears to have kind of recruited to put into that position. I'm sort of interested. There was another person there, the Solicitor General, Noah Purcell, who kind of, I always felt like was on this career path to be the Attorney General. And in fact, at one point in time, if you remember back in 2016, when Governor Inslee temporarily thought he was going to be president, and then the rest of the country mocked us for electing such a clown to governor's office, and he couldn't get any votes around the country, kind of like Kamala Harris. Then suddenly you saw Inslee decide that since he couldn't be governor, he decided to immediately come back and run for a third go-around right at that time. And what was interesting, though, is that you had Ferguson that was going to try to run and had to back out of that race at the last minute. And when he did that, Noah Purcell had originally filed to run for the Attorney General's office, and suddenly he had to, the dominoes kind of push back. And I haven't seen him come up again on the PDC, and he's obviously not running for that office, and Nick Brown instead got the nod. I don't know what Noah Purcell did wrong, but obviously he's got squeezed out, and Nick Brown was chosen as the kind of mini-me of Ferguson. I'm not confident that he has the background, or he really doesn't seem to be as nasty or aggressive or vindictive as Ferguson. So Nick Brown doesn't come across as being that crazy, but he may not be really working for, even though he's technically an executive in the Attorney General's office, it's possible that Nick Brown may actually just be a follower, continue to be a follower, and do whatever Ferguson tells him to do, which is not really his job, but he may not be aware of that. So anyway, the question is, what can they actually do? Well, they can certainly file a lot of the litigation. I don't know how much good that really did Washington State, but it did help Attorney General's fundraising efforts, and perhaps Nick Brown can use it in the same way. I don't know that it's going to necessarily change what happens, especially when I'm going to discuss there's a couple of things that can very much be done by the Trump administration to have an influence in Washington State. So I'm going to use, Deborah, your question, and I'm going to kind of leap right into that topic right now. Probably the state could make deportations of non-U.S. citizens out of our state a little bit harder. I don't really know. We're a sanctuary state, sanctuary state status, and with all the baggage that poorly thought through policy really brings with it, I imagine they can just keep the databases kind of concealed or not cooperate with the feds. But I think at some point in time that resistance comes to an end, kind of like it did in the Jim Crow South. There's only so much effort that the state's going to be able to have that, especially when it comes to fairly common sense policy, that America's only had for a couple hundred years, which is that you can remove people that are here not legally. And that's a pretty normal thing, especially criminals and sex offenders and people who are stealing money. I mean, these are pretty normal people to basically deport. And so I'm sure Ferguson likes having them here in the country, but he's only going to be able to prevent those deportations so much. But let's talk about a couple things the Trump administration could do right now, very quickly anyway, to make a big impact. The Department of Justice essentially gets 2 U.S. attorneys. There's an office in Spokane and one in Seattle. These are essentially appointments that come through the Trump administration. And the Republicans have historically not done a good job choosing their U.S. attorneys, either under the Bush administration or the Trump administration. The first one, or even earlier administrations going back to Bush 1 and even during the Reagan administration, there's typically been nothing that stood out about the U.S. attorneys that were appointed by Republican administrations out in our district in Washington State. When I say that, they've usually just been quiet people who sit there and occupy an office and build up their resume, and nobody knows who they are. And I'm sure they get fat checks when they're done with that position, and a Democrat takes over and they move into some kind of law firm using their resume and experience as a former U.S. attorney. My guess is that the Trump administration has some incentive to actually appoint U.S. district attorney or U.S. attorneys in Washington State. Again, there's 2 of them that they get to appoint that perhaps might, for the first time in at least half a century, be willing to actually look into some public integrity investigations, which the feds clearly have the legal authority to dig into, especially when it comes to the squandering and theft and misuse of public tax dollars, which occurs on a fairly regular basis in Washington State, but nobody really looks into it. Certainly Bob Ferguson looked the other way at every level of corruption. There was nothing he would ever find. And so you never had the state patrol look into this stuff. You pretty much rarely, every now and then the state auditor would accidentally stumble on somebody that was stealing money. And so you might have minor cases against, out of Spokane, I remember in that state treasurer, out of Clown County. I mean, different people would be get caught stealing money, but those were just the accidental cases. There wasn't a lot of activity on digging into public integrity cases. But that creates this false impression that there isn't any bad things going on in Washington State, and that's not true. So if they could actually appoint attorneys there that actually have no fear of going in and looking into public integrity cases and are less concerned about padding their resume with just time on it to claim that they're a U.S. attorney, but actually want to go out and get something done, with the support of the Department of Justice, which I suspect might actually want to do that this time around, that could make quite a big impact in Washington State. That doesn't mean that it necessarily goes after Ferguson itself, but my guess is a lot of his friends have been utilizing their relationship with government and grifting off the system, and inevitably I always wonder why organized crime bothers to even stay in the private sector when it's so much easier to steal so much more money in the public sector, and you're pretty much protected by your friends that you pay off. So it would be curious and interesting to me to see what kind of headway could be had in a change of environment where they're actually serious about investigating public integrity cases. I'd like to point them in a couple of directions. But that's number one. That's a big impact. The Trump administration can genuinely have a significant impact on Washington State with who they appoint in those 2 positions. Another one, and this is a little more esoteric if you care about voter integrity, and who doesn't outside of the Secretary of State and most of the auditors' offices in our country, in our state anyway, we become the laughingstock of America, just like California and Colorado Colorado to some extent, and Arizona, most of whom have imitated Washington's foolish mistake of going down this all mail-in voting type system. And so, well, India seems to have the ability to count 500 million ballots in 3 days. Florida can do 11 million in an afternoon. Many states in the country pretty much knew who they had elected that night. Washington State can't figure it out for weeks as the U.S. Postal Service dredges up whatever ballots they could dig out of the ditch, lost at the distribution center or stuck in a truck somewhere. And these late ballots come in through an incompetent, marginally capable system. And as they all kind of pile up in one place, that's how we get an extra 1,200,000. I think last I looked, there's another 190,000, they say, still to be counted, scattered around the state. Who knows where they came? Who knows if they're postmarked accurately? Who knows anything, really, because they haven't been counted yet. So, the rest of the country pretty much knows what's going on. Our state still doesn't. Neither does portions of California, neither does Arizona until just the last minute. So the rest of the world does mock us and look at us wondering exactly what the heck's going on. Now, the Trump administration has theoretically said that they actually care about voter integrity and they actually want to standardize some of the election processes so that we don't have screwed up systems like Washington State. And if that's the case, any reforms they want to make, I'm sure that's going to take an act of the Republican-controlled Senate and Republican-controlled Congress to do that. Now, the hard part has always been, and they've done this before in the 1990s with motor voter law. In 1964, they did some voter reform back in those days. A lot of that had to do with responding to the Democrats' racist policies in southern states with Jim Crow and other election integrity problems that they had down there. And again, it seems like whenever Democrats get in control, that the election system usually suffers afterwards. So no different than the Jim Crow South or the Reconstruction South after the Civil War or Tammany Hall in New York City. It just seems to be a pattern of behavior, and this is not a bad time to come in and actually start to clean up some of those things. The question is exactly how they would do it. I imagine that if there is a voter integrity push from the federal government, it's going to involve in some way verifying voter ID and re-registering every 4 years or so just to make sure that your signature's current and then you are who you say you are and that you actually exist, making sure you're actually a U.S. citizen, which actually is a requirement in our state, theoretically. And also, I imagine there will be some restrictions on the ability to go with all mail-in ballot systems, at least give people the ability to go and vote at the polls. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I'm actually fairly optimistic there's some push from the federal level on that. But we don't have to wait for that. One of the things that we could do in Washington State is the Department of Homeland Security is actually the entity in which they have lists of everybody who's here legally. So these are non-U.S. citizens that live in Washington State and elsewhere, and they're here on visas of some kind, H-1B visa, worker visa of some kind, maybe guest worker visa or F-1 visas, whatever the visas are that have given them permission to come into the U.S. In other words, they're not going to be expelled from America. They're here legally. However, it would be quite interesting for this list to be made public, something the Trump administration refused to do when activists out here in Washington State tried to approach them back in 2019 and ask for these lists. They refused to provide it. It is clearly within the purview of the federal government and the Trump administration taking over the federal government, at least after January 20th, to look at that list and to make that list public. I'm not asking them really to do anything with the list, just make it public. There's nothing to hide. These people are here legally. They aren't going to be expelled or anything. But there's a fairly sizable number of them here that live in Washington State. And there's 3 questions that we should try to ask and can ask, if we can basically answer them, I should say, within the first 24 hours of that list being made public. Number one, we'd like to know exactly how many of them are registered to vote. And the short answer, just in case there's any surprise out there, is that almost all of them are probably registered to vote in Washington State. Despite all denials to the contrary, I have plenty of examples and plenty of people that have moved here from other countries that they've been registered to vote even against their will. I've done stories about this before. It is not a secret. Everybody knows it, and only the Secretary of State and some of the auditors deny it. So the reality is that that list would help us educate the public about the deficiencies that exist in the current system in preventing non-U.S. citizens from registering to vote in Washington State. The second question, and this is very different than the first one, because in the first one, nobody's broken any laws specifically. It may highlight the incompetence of our voter registration system, but there's no surprise if you've actually bothered to look into it with any degree of seriousness, which means nobody in the media. But outside of the traditional media, any of us who've actually looked at this from a wonkish policy standpoint, going back 15 years now, we know there's a lot of deficiencies in how they register voters in our state, how they manage the voter rolls. So, number one, let's just find out how many non-U.S. citizens are registered, and let's get them cleaned off the list. Number two would be to find out how many of them actually voted, or how many of them had somebody vote for them. So that would be a good answer to at least figure out what the answer is. It also, by the way, depend on the size of this database. Cleaning up this list would actually give us a better sense of what our actual voter participation rate is, because I think in some ways our voter participation rate may actually be better than it looks, because I think there's more people voting as a percentage of legal voters that exist out there than most people realize. But when you fluff it up with crufty voter rolls like this that have a lot of people that are not U.S. citizens on it, it would be interesting to see exactly how many of them are out there. Now, I'm not including people that are here completely illegally or under fake IDs or other things. They've committed other crimes. That's a separate conversation, and probably not something the Department of Homeland Security would be able to help us with initially, other than figuring out if they're criminals that they are going to have to deport them. Now, that's something that's pretty impactful. And the third thing, I mentioned there was three. I talked about whether they're registered to vote, whether they voted or somebody voted for them. And then the third issue is whether they've given campaign finance contributions. Now, it's not uncommon for people that are here on H-1B visa, which are generally people that are paid quite a bit. Amazon, Microsoft, a lot of the tech companies, some of the hospitals bring in a lot of people like this. And they're going to live in the Redmond, Kirkland, Bellevue, Mercer Island kind of area. They make good money, great citizens. They're not citizens, but they're great people to have here. They're working, doing good work. Many of them go back to their home country. Some of them eventually become U.S. citizens. But in the meantime, they're not allowed to finance campaigns in Washington State or at the federal level. And so the Public Disclosure Commission would see if they've given any money in the political contribution side of the process. Now, they aren't in trouble for doing that. Just to be clear, the law is actually pretty clear on this. However, the campaigns that took that money are going to have to refund it to them. So this would be a special bonus for any of those people that are here on these visas. I can help you get your money back. And these are a couple of basic things, simple things that the Trump administration could do if they're actually serious about trying to help us on that issue here. And the other thing that came out, and I wouldn't have thought of this before, but it came up this morning when I was driving in and I heard the Trump administration make their announcement about higher education. And they were talking about decertifying some of the more incompetently and disastrously run colleges in America. Well, the interesting thing about that is I support that approach because there's certainly a lot of reform. I think higher education, I have kids that are both in college now and looking at trying to get into college. And anybody who's done this knows that you're being ripped off by these so-called higher institutions of higher education. I felt that it was expensive and wasteful when I went to college many years ago. It has only gotten worse since then. It is a bloated fest of overpaid and completely worthless bureaucrats. And it would be nice to clean that up and make it so that college is genuinely affordable by people. You don't do that by just forgiving the ridiculous debt they take on. You do that by making the cost just simply lower and easier to access for other people. I do like the idea of decertifying disastrous colleges that do crazy things and actually cause more harm to the kids that go there than help. Evergreen State College should be Exhibit 1 in Washington State. And if there's any college that's ever deserved to be decertified, Evergreen College should be the first one in our state that does that. And that would be a benefit to everybody. Let's not pretend that that's actually a real school and that the people who go there are actually getting a real education. And I think that we could convert that campus into anything except for what it's theoretically being used for right now, which is primarily just a jobs program for unemployed politicians and bureaucrats that couldn't get a job anywhere else. So that, other than I really don't want to demean the janitors, the other people that actually do real work at that college, but the kids that go there and get abused in the current system, they need an opportunity to actually get a real education, and they aren't going to get it there. So decertifying that college would be a great first step. I would also look at the Huxley College division up at Western Washington University. I believe that that's probably something that should be on the short list, perhaps the entire Western Washington University, but we'll see. I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done to dig into some of these colleges and to see exactly what kind of a rat's nest exists there and exactly how much have they ripped off students over the years, ensuring that, I know Western's been known for doing this, ensuring there's no way that a kid can actually get out of the can actually graduate in 4 years. So you're simply throwing another year or two of debt on their future life for no reason, and no valuable reason anyway, giving out fake ghost classes as they've been caught doing, firing their internal auditor because that she was actually willing to expose corruption and problems that existed with their finances there. I don't know how how bad Western is, but it's probably, I don't know that it's approached the level of Evergreen. It's really difficult to get down that low and to hit the bottom that hard. But Evergreen is probably a tough act to follow, but Western could be on that steep dive trying to get to that point at some point. And so it'd be great to actually restore some level of significance to the accreditation process. Didn't even think about that before, but when I heard on the radio, I thought that's a good idea. Let's see. I'm trying to get to some actual questions here, guys. So I'm going to jump in to a few of these and just to see where you are at. There's a number of questions that have popped up here, and now I'm just trying to get back up to the beginning so I don't skip on too many of these anyway. Let's see. Here's a question from Jason Fisher. Thank you for jumping on, Jason. Hey, question, will the Republicans hold what seats they currently have? The answer is they, in the House and the Senate, as best I can tell, there's a couple of really close seats, but as a general rule, a couple of the seats that I thought they might lose on election night actually have swung in a better position. So for the most part, the Washington State Republicans in the Senate, it appears to me they are at risk of losing one seat, which is the 18th legislative seat that, the new Brad Benton is running for down there. And they're at risk of losing that. I mean, he was behind by a couple votes. I haven't looked at the actual numbers again this afternoon. They've probably changed in the last hour or so. So I'll have to look at that again. I'm planning to do a video about this in a little more detail, but that's the one seat at risk that the Senate could potentially lose. And the other seat on the House side is essentially the loss. I think we can say that, unfortunately, it was lost, that Jesse Young was running for. That was a former Republican seat out in the 26th Ledge District, which is kind of part of Pierce County and Gig Harbor. It looks like they have lost that one. Other than that, the seats in the 17th and the 18th, which are the two districts down in, other than the Benton seat, potentially in the Senate, but the other seats look like they're able to retain control over those, as well as the Ron Mazzal, who's a senator up in the 10th legislative district. It looks like they held on to that seat. Those were kind of the seats that were in play. The seats that the Republicans had an opportunity to pick up, generally they squandered those opportunities. In particular, I've been a critic, as I've done in a couple of videos before, but it bears repeating because it's almost impossible to imagine the level of incompetence that's clearly been on display with the House Republican Organizing Committee, PAC, which is the entity that essentially takes surplus funds from the existing state legislatures, and that fund, that PAC kind of serves in theory as an effort to actually increase the number of Republicans that are represented in the state legislature. And through a series of petty and infighting, intramural, narcissistic sort of self-promoting concepts, they decided that the best thing to do was to take $1 million first and burn it up and set it on fire infighting in the primary, and then just to show that incompetence doesn't end there, they decided to squander most of it on dumb things. They did spend some of it helping a few of these candidates survive the current election cycle, but they also squandered it on the 2nd Ledge District, which I brought up before, which was a safe Republican seat. You had 2 Republicans in the general, and either way you won. You don't need to fight there anymore. Let those 2 guys duke it out. And instead, they squandered it. And worse than that, too, not only did they squander it in that district, they attacked Matt Marshall, who's the guy that got elected by a long ways. It wasn't even close. So the incompetence of the Republican consultants working for HROC is impossible to quantify. I don't think you can't even exaggerate it. It's so stupid and bad. If you had just pulled a meth addict out of one of the homeless camps, maybe somebody on fentanyl, and given them that money, they would have been more effective at how it was used than those consultants used the money this time around. I don't know why they're so bad and incompetent. I mean, it's easy to point fingers and identify the incompetence. It's sort of hard to completely understand the motivations behind that sequence of foolish decision-making, but it's significant, and it was certainly put on display by them. Now, the Reagan Fund, which is kind of linked together, it's more lobby money that goes into that one, but it's also kind of directed by the same group of people generally in the Republican leadership. There's an equivalent thing with Senate SRCC, Reorganizing Committee, but that doesn't get a lot of attention because you have fewer seats in play. Essentially, they really only had 2 or 3. They should have spent more money, in my opinion, in the 5th legislative district seat with Morgan. I think that the Senate, I think it was closer than they realized, and a good ground game there could have made a bit of a difference, especially in the Enumclaw area of that district. But that's a little bit more Monday morning quarterbacking. The H-Rock was a train wreck in motion that pretty much everybody outside of whatever clowns they had making the decisions saw coming, and it was just foolish for them to do that. So essentially they're going to lose one seat in each house. I actually think that they're really close. They aren't there yet, but it looks like they'll be able to just barely hold off a supermajority for the Democrats. It's right there on the border, though, and that's not a good thing. So I'm hoping that in about 10 days, both the Republican caucus in the House side and the Republican caucus on the Senate side get a chance to get together and decide who should be in charge. And they should start by probably removing anybody that was involved in the decision-making process and how they squandered their money this last time around. So I suspect that there's going to be some reorganizing that goes on. They're supposed to be doing that out in Wenatchee, and I may just be heading out there. I'm kind of interested in just knowing what's happening. Obviously, as a journalist, I'm not going to be allowed in the decision-making process, but maybe I'll hang out in the hallways and write a blog post or do a video there, because I'm kind of interested in exactly what's going on there, and it does matter. You need a functioning opposition with people that have the ability to use money at least slightly better than what a meth addict would out of a homeless camp in Olympia. So it would be nice if they could actually get some leadership that's a little bit more focused, less on self-destruction, narcissistic king of the molehill arguments, and a little bit more focus on actually regaining very tangibly, and this is not hard to do, regaining some seats, which they can do. Now, on the positive side of things there, the Democrats didn't achieve the goal that they were hoping to get with their reorg and redistricting multi-million-dollar, multi-year fight over the 14th legislative district in eastern Washington, where essentially the Democrats' leftist arguments were basically that even though that was a majority Hispanic district, those Hispanics, by God, voted too much for Trump and Republicans, and so therefore they aren't real Hispanics. So the racist argument that the Democrats and the left used is that you needed to make it a majority Hispanic district, but only Hispanics count if they vote for Democrats. And so they went through this convoluted multi-year litigation, and at the end of the day, they found a judge corrupt enough to actually go down the rabbit hole with them. And in the redistricting process, because each district essentially has to have the same number of people there, it impacted the district boundaries on 12 other districts, which were all pretty much held by Republicans. I think one of them was a Democrat district, but the rest of them were all Republican districts. And it was so confusing the way it impacted it that it actually crossed over the Cascades and affected multiple districts that were actually more on the west side, the 5th Ledge District being one of them, and the 17th and 18th down the Clark County area with Skamania and Clark County down there. Now, to some extent, though, they actually made the 5th legislative district a little more conservative, and I just think the Democrats screwed up in not understanding that the trend line, apparently, for Hispanic voters in Washington state is counter to their racist approach to people voting by their ethnicity, is that those things are changing, and it looks like the Hispanic population, including around Yakima, which is where the district's located, are actually voting for more Republicans now than they ever have before, and so that trend line continues to go in that direction, not just for Trump, but even for the local races. And so the Democrats failed completely to get this pickup seat that they were hoping to get in eastern Washington, and all they served to do is simply harass the Republicans and cause a bunch of chaos amongst them, which was probably an extra bonus for them. But it also, I think, has created an opportunity. It did create some disruption in the 17th and 18th Ledge District in Clark County, but it also made an impact in the 5th. And the 5th, which is kind of this Enumclaw-Issaquah area, based on Morgan and Hargrove's results, indicates to me that with a well-funded, well-planned out campaign in advance, that Republicans can start winning the 5th legislative district again, which is interesting and should be part of the plan moving forward if H-Rock can ever figure out how to not squander their money fighting amongst themselves. Of course, they aren't the only ones out there, so it'd be interesting to see if they could do that. Next question, Esther Hemming. What about the print your own ballot in King County? Yes, it's a bad idea. Don't like it. Omni Ballot is sort of involved in this process, which is this outside, unvetted leftist organization that is currently involved in litigation, and I'm very happy to tell you that the Republicans have finally decided to engage in some of these fights, and this is a good one to fight on, where they used Omni Ballot to basically go back and supposedly supposedly cure ballots with no validation. The person carrying the ballot is the person you're actually trying to reach there. So that case is in court. We just have to keep moving in that direction. Let's see, Brian B., was there anything that surprised you about the election results, good or bad? Good question. There were some things that I did find surprising. There were some outcomes I was hoping would be different in some local races in particular. I did think the sheriff race in Pierce County ended up going pretty well, surprising me in that race, especially because I know how difficult sheriff races can be sometimes. Also, I was hoping that Kelly Chambers would do better in Pierce County than it looks like she did. Again, I think there was a real weakness with the consultant campaign there. The Pierce County Republicans, I thought, did a pretty good job with their support for her in that race, but the consultants definitely squandered the money they got, and I don't think that helped her in her effort to try to get over the finish line there. The I-2066 that did pass, the initiative from Let's Go Washington, repealing the natural gas ban, that I think was, I would have expected a larger success level than what they saw in the end. I'm glad that it passed. It's just, I was hoping that it'd be more successful. The 3rd Congressional District, which is where I live, I think Joe Kent underperformed where he should have been in that race. And one of the things I'm digging into that, and we'll have to see these numbers as they come by. And by the way, he lost. I mean, I don't think that I know there's still some more ballots to count there, but the delta between him and the incumbent Democrat, Marie Glusenkamp, is fairly large. I don't think that, and that district voted for Trump. So somehow in the 3rd Congressional District, there's, I don't know, 20,000 or 30,000 people who decided they would vote for Trump and then vote for the Democrat in Congress. And I'm curious to see the profile of that voter makeup. I don't think we have results by precinct yet in all 7 of those counties down there, but I'm curious to see what that's actually going to look like, because I think Perez did a pretty good job, at least putting on an image of not being as crazy as most of the other Democrats in Congress. Whether or not she actually voted with them is not the issue. She puts on an image that I think she's not as crazy and woke and nuts as most of them are. And so that was a good image to put on, especially in Lewis County, which happens to be one of the most conservative counties in Washington State by voter result over recent times. And they actually went more in her direction than they voted for a Democrat for Congress in a long, long time. Now, there was a lot of outreach and millions of dollars spent. To be fair to Joe Kent, he was outspent by about $15 million in just continuous, endless negative attacks on his campaign. One of the problems on his campaign, I think, and I'm going to do a little more research on this, is it looks like they completely, I think I was misled on what they were going to do for their outreach and doorbelling and voter turnout operations. There were a couple of volunteer groups that did a pretty decent job in a couple of local areas, but the overall campaign was supposed to be running this program through the consultant there, and I actually believed it was funded, but I never saw any evidence of it actually being utilized. And so if it turns out they dropped the ball on that, that was a big failure, because those campaigns, when effectively run, will shift the needle in your direction by a point or two, and that's pretty much all he needed in this race to win. The question moving forward, and I think there was still a little bit of Republican division in that race reflected in the results, it would be good for Republicans and conservatives, people who care about liberty and freedom, to actually better understand these divisions and how they're occurring on the Republican side. It's not just an all finger pointing at one person or another, but people voted for Trump in that district. It's after that they kind of fell off the table. Another thing to point out too, now this doesn't surprise me too much, but overall, and again I don't have the final numbers because we're still counting another couple 100,000 votes in our regressive and archaic and creaky voting system that we have in our state, but there was an undervote from the Trump vote overall. Now, Trump got about 38% of the vote, and it looks like there were about 100 to maybe 200,000 people that in our state that voted for at the presidential level, and then just decided not to vote for anybody in the statewide offices down below. Now, that happens sometimes, but it was surprising to see how much of that was. But it wasn't just that. You also had 100,000 people, roughly. I'm rounding these numbers, and we'll be able to give you the exact numbers once they finally certify the election. We get a final count. But it looked like about 100,000 people decided that the Harris ticket, Harris-Walz ticket, was the choice. But when it came to these other Republican seats, they voted for Republicans, down ticket from there. People can argue that's the Never Trump vote. Maybe it's out there, maybe it isn't. But it's surprising to me that you would see that much of a difference, especially across all these state executive positions that Republicans are running for. I was surprised at the total amount of money that came in to support Ferguson. He was obviously worried, and he had over $30 million coming in on his governor's race, whereas Reichert had close to $7 million. That is the best funded Republican campaign we've had since 2012, but nowhere near enough to compete equivalent to 30 million plus. When I say that, I'm talking about not just the individual campaign expenditures, which were about I can't remember, 6 million and 12 million. I know that Ferguson outspent Reichert at least twice from his own campaign, but the real money in the Ferguson race came from these outside entities that jumped in with 8 million and 7 million, either attacking Reichert or promoting Bob Ferguson. And so when you add that up, that's a lot of money. I mean, it's not quite as much as you saw coming out in opposition to the initiatives and trying to fight against people attempting to cut the taxes. But that was definitely an issue. Another thing you asked me about surprises, I was surprised at how many people were confused by and I shouldn't have been, but I was. The number of people on these initiatives, this is hard. I had a ton of people coming up to me after the election and say, I voted against all those tax increases. Totally confused because of Ferguson's statement, thinking that because it was so confusing, they thought that they were voting against taxes rather than vote yes, pay less, right? And so it was and it was caused entirely by that impact statement that the legislature passed in 2022 to ensure that they could tip the scales against the people and make it harder for them to repeal taxes. The way it's never been used before, it was just used this year for the first time, and the way it was used was very dishonest and corrupt, which is consistent with Bob Ferguson's entire public service. But it was definitely a problem. I can't believe how many people I've talked to after the election, and they're coming up to me telling me, "Oh yeah, I voted no against those darn taxes," not realizing that they voted in favor of the taxes, and so that was ridiculous, and there was a lot of problems with that. I think it caused more problems than I had realized it would. This is consistent with Michael Davidson here. Talked to many people, realized they voted wrong. Yes, it's actually U.S. Attorney Diane, that's what I'm referring to there. I might have used the wrong terminology. I'm sorry about that. Chris Cook, how can elections be legal with no voter ID? Well, welcome to Washington. We don't really check anything, and we don't do a good job cleaning up our voter rolls. And just in case you don't realize that, the media will never report it, but I did notice that King 5 News accidentally committed an act of journalism at least once this year, and they reported on the gal out, I can't remember where she was, Seattle, someplace in King County, who was annoyed because she got 16 ballots at her address, and none of them were her, and she didn't know who any of them were, and she was concerned about who these people were because she lived there for a while, and there was no clarity as to what happened. The funny and ridiculous thing was that King County Elections and Orwellian speak simply chose to ignore that issue and pretend like it didn't happen and just say, don't worry, everybody gets a chance to vote. Well, we don't know what you're doing with your, and obviously the voter rolls are all screwed up, and that's why they sent 16 ballots to her place, and they're refusing to clean it up. And there's an issue with that for a long time. Let's see. Jason, normally people refer to this, the confusing language on referendums, which are purposely also done in a way to confuse the voters as much as they possibly can. There's nothing that the legislature despises more than the people actually having the ability to repeal a stupid piece of legislation that the legislature puts through, which is why the referendum process has been generally corrupted over time to make it super confusing. Initiatives, though, have historically not had these impact statements on on them. That's a new thing that was created in 2022, especially having it be on the ballot. And that was really specifically designed to hurt people and to make them think that they were voting in opposition to the taxes, which polling generally showed they did not support, and make them think that voting no was the solution when voting yes was actually it. It was kind of ridiculous. So anyway, a lot of work to do on this. And anyway, we'll see where we go. Let me try drop down to questions. Let's see. Thurston County's lost millions of the taxpayer dollars. Yes, they have. Thurston County's not alone in that, by the way. In fact, most counties in Washington state squander your money pretty much every day and every time elected officials show up in office. The elected officials may not be aware of it. The bureaucrats pretty much do a pretty good job squandering most of that money when they get their hands on it. And if you do go to the county commission, and especially I think this next Thurston County Commission cycle is going to be a clown show. And then Tumwater City Council, you'll definitely understand why. Go to the Olympia City Council or Seattle or Bellingham. It's easy to Spokane. And you can see what happens when you elect really bad people to office. Jason, question, is it safe to say all that stuff Ferguson said on the campaign about hiring police officers and homeless will go out the window to stop Trump? Yes, it is. If there's one person who doesn't care about public safety, it's definitely Bob Ferguson, unless he has to pretend that he cares about it so that he can protect his political career. What's interesting is he felt that he was at risk enough that he had to do that. Now that he knows that perhaps somebody may, for the first time in half a century, actually bother to look into public integrity cases in Washington state, then Ferguson's, at least his allies, might be pretty concerned. And there's a lot to hide. So I'm curious to see where that goes. And I do hope the Trump administration actually does some percentage of what they say they're actually going to do. I hope that they will. And Mama Thong, thank God, and Trump wants all sanctuary cities gone. It's why they're crying. It's certainly one of the issues, but we'll have to see. Diesel for the People News, and the question down here, do you believe we need to get rid of 1947 Administrative Act? I do. I don't have that one memorized. I'm familiar. Some of the civil service acts that you're referring to have generally created a protected class of citizens in the civil service to the degree that they certainly don't earn it. The challenge with bureaucracy is that bureaucracy mostly exists to bloat and promote itself. That's the nature of bureaucracy. It's human nature. It's not a conspiracy. It's what happens. Big business runs into the same problem. Boeing is guilty of this, as Microsoft or Amazon or Google. The big companies, once they get a certain size, the bureaucratic nature of this entity tends to grow and bloat itself. And at least private companies, they eventually hit the wall and lose money. But government doesn't have to be competent. They don't have to do what they say they're going to do. And in fact, incompetence tend to be rewarded in the bureaucracy. So the challenge is anything in the administrative code that doesn't let us reform and fix the problems that exist in the sloppy kind of incompetence that we see all the time, and the corruption that inevitably that creates. We got to go back and actually try to do something to fix it. So, but I doubt that's the only thing that needs to be done. Stephen Skihan, the way the initiatives are written should there be a lawsuit? They all seem to be written in a slant. Yeah, and it's not the way. There's actually a couple different things. One is the ballot title. One is which the AG also writes, but at least you have an argument against it. These impact statements that you saw on the ballots, they're just garbage that the AG posted to help his donor base and to confuse voters in a way that a lot of them would do exactly what they told me they do. They thought they were opposing taxes by voting no. It was terrible. So anyway, it's a challenge, and we got a lot of work to do on this. And I think there's going to be a much greater pushback in a lot of different ways in the state. It's not just going to be from the federal level. Deanne Sanderson, can we implement the strategies that Charlie Kirk did in swing states in our red counties? We need more Republican registration and chasing of ballots. In our state, that's a good question, Deanne. I like that question. One of the things that I think tends to happen is that people will see something that happens in the state and they'll just say we can implement the exact same thing here. In Washington state, almost everybody is registered to vote. To avoid getting registered to vote, you have had to struggle in this state. It is work because they will register you to vote with any interaction that you have with a state agency. They'll register you to vote against your will. They'll register you to vote without your knowledge. They just register you to vote everywhere. I don't think think we're missing a lot on voter registration. We could be missing some. I think where we're missing it would be mostly on like military, potential military voters around like Fort Lewis and some of these other places, getting them to register here and not their home states. That would be a great campaign. It's a useful one because you would change the makeup, in particular in the 28th Leg District. But the real chasing the ballots or ballot harvesting, you could do a much better job. The Republicans have resisted that because they don't like the law that allows them to do that. In many states, that's illegal. In Washington, that's perfectly legal, and they like doing it here. So you have no choice. But if you're going to be participate in the process, you got to go out and do it yourself. We could do that a lot better. And whether that's Charlie Kirk's approach or a different model, when people have done equivalent sort of operations in levels of scale in our state, they have made a big impact on the conservative side. But that's not enough. There's really also a media campaign that needs to be involved here, and that's something that our side needs to basically come in. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. Chaz E., when the new administration's inaugurated, do you see the state of Greater Oregon becoming viable? I don't know. I mean, really, what you could do is just create the state of Seattle and the state of Portland, and they could experiment with their utopian schemes to their heart's content there and destroy those cities much quicker and easier than destroying the rest of the state with them. So I would advocate that you're actually not really looking at this correctly. You want to really set Seattle and Seattle itself and Portland itself, let them get set up in their own city-state, and we can see exactly what kind of disaster that becomes. But anyway, so we'll see how it goes. I find it unlikely. There's been arguments that have been proposed. I think it's highly unlikely this administration, even controlling the three branches of government, go down this path, because there's been this argument in Illinois and New York, in California, of course, Washington, Oregon. You've seen it in was it Minnesota? There was a couple of more states that have also had this argument where they want to split up and expand. And there's some rational thoughts behind that, but typically when that's done, it's done in a way that ensures that, at least on the Senate side of things, that there's some equal representation to both parties. For example, Washington State, if it was to split into the city of, or the state of Seattle and the rest of Washington, then you would still have senators now. They would kind of cancel each other out. Presumably, you have 2 blue senators from Seattle and 2 conservative senators from the rest of the state. So they would usually do something along those lines if they were going to run down the state of liberty, the conversations that we've had in the past. Those kind of ideas tend to produce that kind of result. Let's see. USPS isn't the problem. Cooper's Loan, no, you're wrong, actually. And I'm going to tell you, U.S. postal workers have been coming to me about the problems there for years. They aren't the only problem, and it's not some kind of a conspiracy. It's just some collapse in the system that's occurring there, where ballots are being mismarked, lost, shredded. New employees are being not trained. The employees at the U.S. Post Office are being overworked to the point that out of desperation and anger and frustration, they just dump all the ballots in the garbage, thinking it's junk mail, not even being educated enough to know their ballots. It's all kinds of other issues. It's not the only thing, but it's an element of mail-in voting that's problematic. There's no chain of custody. You don't know what happens to your ballot once you send it out, and neither does anybody else. So that's an issue. Let's see, N plus fold. Let's see, Washington, being a border state, is always left off national discussions, which is odd. This usually occurs when there's a federal investigation underway. Yeah, I don't know if there's any actual investigation, but there should be. Manny, you're then the first person, I think, officially to ask this question, but you're not alone. Many people have asked this many times. You want to abolish all mail-in voting, you could do it at the federal level, like they've done with various voter reform acts in the past. And that might be on the agenda right now, but that's going to be the quickest and fastest way of it occurring here, unless the courts intervened and then said that it would be illegal from that perspective, which we've seen a couple of rulings in a few other states that sort of imply that's a direction that some of the federal courts might go, at least at the lower level. We really don't know how they would treat this at the federal level, at the Supreme Court level. But the feds certainly have the ability to control election, or to influence elections and to change how they're done. And usually if they're done at the federal elections, they'll apply that to statewide elections as well. So there's a lot of work there to do. We'll see what happens. Let's see. got a voter's report card a few weeks before the election. It shows 3 voters since we moved here in 2018, but only my wife and I live here. Alan Colvin, you're not wrong. That comes up all the time. When I've doorbelled homes, say there's 10 people registered to vote here, and the people who live there look at it. They don't know who any of the other 7 people are. That's come up and happened many times. The Secretary of State and the Auditor's Office are in denial about that, of course. They want to pretend like it's not happening, and that's why they typically threaten us with litigation and lawsuits and other threats anytime that we work on cleaning up the voter roll. The voter rolls are where the problem is. I wish that we could get out there and do some work on it at a more effective rate, but typically what's happened is every time we try to work on it, the auditors lobby to reduce transparency and to make it more difficult to clean up the voter roll. So the Secretary of State and the state auditors are opposed to transparency, honesty, accuracy, or anything related to voter roll reform. Consistently and without fail, they've almost always been on that side of the equation. So the feds at some point in time may have to step in and help clean it up, and I hope they do. We definitely need it in this state. I'm trying to get to questions, guys. A lot of different things coming up here. D. Rambo, maybe it is time for an overall state audit by the federal government under Trump. I'm not sure the feds are actually set up to do any kind of an audit. You could have the Inspector General, which is a federal agency, and we don't have anything equivalent to that at the state level. You could have them come in and probably do some deep dive audits on federal funds. They have a mandate for this. So if the state accepts federal funds, then anything they've accepted federal funds for, they could go and do a deep dive audit. In fact, if you're the Trump administration right now and you're really happy with Bob Ferguson and you want to make him experience some of the joys of trying to reform and fix government, then you could have the Inspector General decide that they're going to come in and do this deep dive digs into auditing all this federal money that's come into Washington and probably been squandered and wasted and lost and stolen in some cases. And if they don't allow it, then you could always just withhold future funding to the state. I imagine that there's some element of that going on. One of the things that probably does need to be reformed in our state is the DSH's fraud investigation unit. Technically, the feds outsource their fraud investigation to the states. The problem is the states actually have an incentive not to find any fraud because anytime they find fraud, however much fraud they do find gets deducted from the overall grants coming from the feds. So the incentive at the state level is to put together a facade and pretend like they're looking for fraud, but then to actually not really find fraud so they can keep the big cash spigot coming to the state because they don't want to reduce it by the fraud that they find. This is a terrible incentive structure. It actually doesn't achieve anything, yet everybody gets to pretend like they're actually doing something to look at it. These are some basic reforms that could be done, and it would make an impact. Alan Colvin, sorry I missed this question. It was actually up higher. How did Maria Perez possibly win my district? We were all red, minus Vancouver. That's true, except that many people in Lewis County and other places decided to vote for Trump and then vote for the Democrat in Congress, and they did. You can't argue with that. That's exactly what it appeared many people did. So that'd be a good question. I would start asking, trying to find those people. I'm really curious how most of those people are. But anyway, we'll just have to keep looking at it. And there's all kinds of opportunities to fix a lot of things in the state. And for a change, we may actually get a little bit of federal support on that side. I'd be surprised, but we might. Chazzy put in a public records request requesting how many people we dropped from the voter rolls who were illegals. And they wouldn't tell me and told me I couldn't inquire for a year. Yeah, well, they won't tell you. They're going to keep that information secret because the last thing the bureaucracy wants you to know is how bad and broken the system already is when it comes to who they register to vote in the first place. So, of course, they're not going to tell you that. Let's keep going down here. There's another question right down here. Defund Evergreen. Yep, that would be good. That'd be a good start. At least decertify them and stop pretending they're an education system. Let's see. Deborah, also, you brought up a couple of interesting points here, and I think there's some accuracy to this as well. I mean, there was an overwhelm. I live in the 3rd Congressional District, so I saw the ads like endlessly coming in, every single YouTube video, and they did a good job. The Joe Kent campaign didn't have that kind of money, but you can overcome the money difference. I think people don't appreciate how much you can. the Democrats squander a large percentage of their cash, just like many of the traditional Republican groups do, on consultant kickback schemes and wasteful, pointless advertising campaigns that help them get their kickbacks but don't necessarily move the needle. They don't really care. They just convince the donors that this is going to be how they run their campaign. Now, some of that stuff can work if it's done well, but that requires you to do it well, which is rarely something you're going to see. And especially not in a place like Washington State, which is kind of considered a backwater America when it comes to the big election fights. It's not like we get the top-of-the-line consultants that come out here to work. They usually fail everywhere else, and then they kind of settle in the backwater of Washington. That's a problem because then we don't really get quality consulting work done here. And to be fair to the consultants, they essentially, it's a weird job. You basically get a paycheck every 4 years that's big, every 2 years if you're kind of on task a little bit, and in between you're starving. So it's got to be kind of a challenging business model to have, and especially if you're in a state that Republicans have historically not done very well, or kind of the big fish in a small pond kind of syndrome problem that we do have in Washington State, where you have a handful of homegrown consultants that will do everything they can to undermine and destroy anybody else that's potentially coming in and stepping on their turf. It has nothing to do with quality of work. It just all has to do with personality and who gets the cash at the end of the day. And those fights go on, and that's difficult to overcome. So that is one of those issues that we are going to have to address here. Let's see, Delinda House, the Department of Ecology needs to be either completely overhauled or shut down. Our education levels are down in litter boxes in the classrooms. Yes, they are. But let me just, this is leading me specifically to quite a question that is worth looking at, too. Just a little weird scenario that kind of popped up recently. One of Ferguson's announcements that he had, that some of you probably know, that Chris Reichdahl, probably the greatest poster child for promoting homeschooling and private schooling in the history of Washington State. Nobody has actually been as incompetent or self-destructive to the public education system than Chris Reichdahl has been as OSPI. He's kind of like become this poster child of why 47,000 families have pulled their kids out of public school, put them in a private school or homeschooled. And Chris Reichdahl is the reason. It's not even about politics. I mean, a lot of the people in the Bellevue, kind of North Shore, Issaquah, Kirkland area, in Seattle, they pulled their kids out because the school system is largely failing them. But also, they had money. It wasn't even about politics or DEI or any other that stuff. It really was more about, listen, I actually believe math is real. I can identify what a woman is. And I just want my kids to have a good chance to get into a good college. And you have a very highly educated group of parents that live up there. That group of parents up there, at least the earlier iteration of that group of parents groups, they were the ones who brought in the original high cap program in Washington State, which was actually quite good and pretty advanced. But Chris Reichdahl's done his best to destroy the education system more than anybody else ever has. And by doing that and convincing so many people to flee his abuses, it's dumbed everything down in a substantial way, also encouraging or preventing teachers from being able to deal with discipline issues in the classroom, which further erodes the education environment, bloating the budget, which mostly is just going to pay people a lot more money and deliver a lot lower quality result, which is kind of the definition of government. Meanwhile, even the Seattle Times knew this guy was a crazy nut job, and they wouldn't endorse him in the primary. But in the general, the Seattle Times is competent, and I mean, they're just completely corrupt. So I'm nobody watching this video actually reads the Seattle Times and believes what you see there, of course, but it's still worth reiterating. It used to be a newspaper that used to employ journalists. They don't really anymore. It's just more of a house organ of the Democrat Party in Washington State for the most part. However, Reichdahl was so bad, and it is a nonpartisan position, that everybody recognized his incompetence and disaster in that position. So he gets elected. Now, it's a closer race than some of the other statewide offices, but Reichdahl did win. But immediately after winning, he and Ferguson come out and they say that they want to eliminate the ability of the voters to actually vote for OSPI director, which is funny because it's essentially Reichdahl admitting that he's so bad and so incompetent and so disastrous that no sane person would ever vote for him again. He doesn't even want to be on the ballot again, and he just wants the Ferguson or a future governor to appoint somebody to run the school system instead of have the voters decide, which is classic. And there's hay to be made on this whole story. So Reichdahl definitely deserves, boy, that's definitely a problem there. SRV, both my kids graduated from Western and working, paying taxes. Thank God, you're fortunate. And hopefully they paid off those bloated student loans. Listen, I lived in Bellingham. I had a lot of friends that went to Western. I have a friend that teaches there right now. But the whistleblowers that I've got out of Western have indicated that Western's attempting to turn itself into the next evergreen as fast as they can. If they can avoid that, that'd be great. But I suspect that they're well on the way, and Huxley College is a big part of that descent into destruction. No, UW is not innocent either. I reckon I see somebody with another comment down here, so we'll just see how it goes. I would like to see this decertification process from the federal government, at least as long as they're holding up things like not ripping off students, not bloating your bureaucracy, not bringing in the DEI architecture that's just a squandering of resources into esoteric kind of Marxist training programs. If you clean up that so that, shocking thought, you actually get back to teaching people how to do things that matter in the real world instead of whatever their agenda might be. Question here from Sue Bell. How many public-private partnerships does Bill Gates and or his philanthropies have with the state, and how do these partnerships affect the outcomes of Washington legislation and policy making? That is a great question, and Bill Gates isn't alone on this. People do tend to focus, but you have Nick Hanna, Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Bill Stolte, a lot of these other people that are billionaires, and then some of them that aren't quite at that level. And a lot of these people are basically one of their arguments is that they want the state to do what they would otherwise do if they were willing to actually use their money for philanthropic sort of purposes. And there's a logic to it. I mean, Nick Hanauer essentially articulates it best when he says that he wants to convince the people who go in with him to spend $1 million and then get the state to spend a bunch more money. And so that money spent on lobbying is actually more effective because they can take that $1 million, buy their politicians or at least influence who gets in there and the decisions that they make, and then get the state or the feds to kick in a lot more money into whatever pet project that those billionaires might want in the first place. And so it kind of makes sense, right? That's what you would do. And so I think that's happening more often than people think. Let's see. Deborah McClory, you're talking about Trump. Oh, Department of Education. That's funny. I said Department of Ecology. Sorry about this. This is funny. Yes, DOE. We're all using shorthand acronyms, and I used the wrong one. So Department of Education. Great correction on my part. To me. Deborah McClory, I just saw that Trump officially appointed Elon and Vivek to head his new Department of Government Efficiency. Well, I'm really curious. This is actually, to me, as like a wonkish guy that wants to downsize government, this is probably one of the most exciting developments in modern times that's occurred at least since the 80s and probably earlier than that, where there does seem to at least be some level of interest in downsizing the deep state or the big government or whatever you want to call it, the bloated nature of government being what it is. It's less about a conspiracy than just the nature of man when you actually get into those situations and the way it grows. And the bigger government gets, the smaller your freedom and liberties get. So if they can actually make an impact there, I hope that they're willing to move in that direction. Tanker Jag, both Pete Serrano and William Pickett have told me that they're interested in serving as U.S. attorneys in the Trump administration. Thoughts? Well, I think the more good attorneys that they can get in that position. Remember, it's not just the head guy there. He also is going to have to hire some people. I think we have a good list. I don't want to lose all of our handful of good attorneys that we have in the state to help us in private cases, but we'll see where they go. Major Greg Carpenter in the 4th Congressional District. How can one vote for Dan Newhouse when he's done nothing in his office and voted to impeach Trump twice and lies about his opponent, Jared Sessler? Well, I'll tell you why it looks to me like Newhouse has probably won that race. The gap is too much for Sessler to make up at this point in time with the number of ballots left. And in a way, that's a little bit less surprising than the third, only because there was always this concern when you had two Republicans running the race. You have in that district, and that's one of the more Republican districts in the state of Washington at a congressional level, that you would have the Democrats cross over and vote for Newhouse because he is clearly aligned more with them than he is with the Republican agenda in that district. And that's not a hard thing to figure out, actually. If you look at the last two primaries, Newhouse has been around 25%. What's gotten him to survive those primaries is the flood of other people running for office. In this most recent primary, it was really the lack of a serious Democrat to run in that position. The minute a serious Democrat runs against Newhouse, it looks like anyway, and a serious Republican, the Newhouse is going to lose in the primary and he won't make it through. So I think he knows that. I mean, I know that I'm hearing that he's not going to run again, but we'll see. It's very hard for people, especially if you've been enriched by your involvement in Washington, D.C., to kind of give up that access to power and money that you have over there. So oftentimes candidates will put out these rumors saying, I'm done, I'm not going to run again. It happens all the time, but I'll believe it when I see it. But yeah, Sessler missed out on that race, not because Republicans didn't turn out for him, although they turned out a little bit weaker than I'd expect in the fourth, but also because the Democrats en masse definitely came out and supported Newhouse, and it made it helped Newhouse get over the finish line. It looked like about a 6 to 8% increase in Democrat votes in that center district. Kitsap Schools held a funding, here, Leonard Goodman. Kitsap Schools held a funding for schools, and it failed the first time, a levy for the schools, I'm sure. After it failed, they put it out again, and it passed, and now we have to pay more tax. Was it legal for them to do it? And the answer to that, Leonard, is yes, it is. They can do that actually 3 times in a row before they have to take a break. So if you fail the first time, you got to come back and try again. That is something that they can do. Now, there's things you could do to make that a little bit more challenging from a policy and wonkish standpoint. I'd like to do these things. For instance, I think I'd like to eliminate all special elections and simply have all of those votes on the November ballot, because you'd have higher rates of voter participation, better buy-in to the decision, whichever way it's going to go. It would save money for both the Secretary of State and the local auditors to have it concentrated at that point, and it would also be less expensive for the local jurisdictions that do have to pay a portion for the cost of the election if they have one of their initiatives on the ballot. And the reason why those local entities don't want to do that is they want to reduce the amount of voter participation on those levies, because if they had higher voter participation, the general rule of thumb is that they'd probably lose those tax increases. The last thing they want to do is lose them, so they want to keep it going, and that's why you see them do that. But I'm sorry that happened to you out there. You aren't alone, and there's definitely a fairly big issue with that. Yes, the top 2 primary system, when the 2 R's in the general favors a more liberal R. That's true. It does happen. Sorry, I'm just kind of summarizing your thing. Let's see. If Trump dismantles the Department of Education, which I'm assuming is what you're referring to, will this create a gateway for Ferguson to promote a state income tax? No, not by itself. I mean, Ferguson doesn't need an excuse. He already has the capital gains tax that they're going to use, as they promised to use it, as a income tax access point. There's a little bit more of a fight coming than just that, but so he's already got it. Doesn't the Department of Ecology Department of Education? Just so you know, the Department of Education approximately provides 8 to 9% of an average school district's income in the state of Washington. At least the last time I looked at it, any serious volume of budgets. And so losing that money mostly affects the free and reduced lunch program in schools. And then second, it also reduces some of the special education programs, which generally could be picked up by most school districts somewhere else in their budget if it went away. It's not going to be the end of the world if that money goes away. So anyway. And Thunderstriker, I didn't skip you. You just had a bunch of things that weren't questions up there earlier. Let's see. I am trying to get down here. Deborah McCoy. Let's see. T.Z. Burton, what is the point of even voting Republican in this state if they are their own worst enemy? Well, I mean, I don't think that everybody is. I think you just have people who get in charge of a molehill somewhere, and then that's their power base, and so they're excited to be in charge of the molehill. And so they're going to argue. They don't want anybody else to come in and rain on their parade. You know, it's like keeping people out of the wine and cheese club meetings that you have. That tends to be more the argument. By the way, this happens all over the place, not just politics. You just see it most visibly in the political side. And it's most absurd, of course, when you have a group of people that are actually in the political minority. Why would they be arguing this way? But, you know, you used to see this in D.C. back when the Republicans didn't have a majority in Congress in the 80s. And essentially, the Republicans spent more time in the 80s fighting in Congress against each other than they did in trying to recapture the majority. When they accidentally captured the majority in 1994, they hardly knew what to do with it. So these are the kind of things, it's just a human nature kind of issue. And that's why when they say bipartisanship, I mean, there's things you're going to find a bipartisanship agreement on, but it does require both sides to be fairly reasonable. And right now we have one political side, especially in our state, that believes math isn't real, believes everybody's racist. They can't identify what a woman is. They think it's a good idea to have boys beating up on girls in girls' sports. And they have no expectation that there should be any restrictions on how government spends its money or what it intrudes on. That's hard to compromise with when you have that belief system. You saw Pramila Jayapal recently, the delusional and beautiful spokesperson for the Democrats. I want her to get on TV as much as possible. She's nuts. And it's great to have somebody like that represent the Democrats of Washington State, demonstrating just how crazy they really are. But it's difficult to compromise with somebody who's that corrupt and dishonest and weird. You're going to end up having to just simply grow your side bigger so that you can actually fix things. So we'll see. Anyway, let's see. I'm trying to get down some questions here because I am going to be running out of time before too long. I do have a Zoom event after this I have to go to. So Cronus Magnus, do those in Republican Party in Washington State have the ability to work cohesively together to advance more conservative policies? Sure, some of them do. And I don't think it's fair to lump everybody in the same category, but some of them don't, some of them do. And we just need the people who do to actually be in charge of whatever the little fiefdom is that they have, and recognize that it's not bequeathed to them like a king or something. They're just going to be temporarily occupying that position while they're trying to advance, hopefully, liberty and freedom in our state, which is what we want. Let's see. Kenneth Boren, I'm guilty of voting for Newhouse. Sessler, at least by the commercials, sounded like he was anti-dairy, anti-beef, pro-tax, and also from King County. I live in Pasco. Sessler's a no-go for me. Well, I'm sorry, Kenneth. You and the Democrats, that's how it goes. I'm sorry you believed your ads. But that's why they run those ads, is to convince people like you to vote differently. Let's see. Just keep working. Let me see. We'll see what okay, Deborah McClory, you don't really ask a question, but I'm going to bring this up anyway here. Trump will do all he can do to secure our elections, including same-day voting, voter identification, paper ballots, and proof of citizenship. Well, we'll see. I mean, I hope he does. We already have paper ballots. That's not a good idea. Same-day voter registration is a problem, but same-day voting is a good idea. In-person voting would be helpful, and I think definitely resolving the voter identification problem for elections it really does matter. So I'm optimistic that there's some version of this that the Trump administration could move ahead on, but we'll see what happens. That's Enfold. That's good about Omni ballot case. If they find wrongdoing, when can elections be overturned? That's rarely how it goes. I mean, more than likely what would really happen is they would probably just eliminate it as an option moving forward, and the grift, whatever grift this little consultant kickback scheme is, would go away, and those guys would have to get their money from somewhere else. I mean, that tends to be what it is. Don't expect justice. That's not really how it goes, but you can fix things and institute reform. I wish there was a path for justice. There usually isn't, but you can take the problems and typically fix things moving forward if you get enough momentum and capable people on your side willing to push it. T.T. Burton, what do you think of Trump's cabinet picks? So far, generally, I like them, but listen, I don't put my faith in politicians. I put my faith in ideas and objectives and goals, finding other people that we can work together and move the ball forward, hopefully on advancing liberty and freedom in some way or another. But hopefully these cabinet picks that he has made are going to stick to their guns. Some of them will inevitably fail. Some of them will turn out to be corrupt. We will just have to see. It would be really interesting to see if some of them really stick to just any percentage of the conversation they're talking about right now. I feel like they've moved the Overton window quite a bit to include areas like what Musk is talking about and really reforming government. And I'm a skeptic of Musk. I don't like the Tesla EV kickback scheme associated with the governments. I don't like Neuralink project. I love what he's been doing on SpaceX. That's pretty impressive. I love what he's done and taking over Twitter with X. Those are great things. But it was interesting. I think he's kind of gone through his own evolution, and it would be really interesting to see if somebody at that caliber and that skill set actually has the ability to reform government in some significant way. I think it's really a challenge. But if they've been given authority and believe they can do it, it'd be great to see if they could really make the impact that he says they can. Let's see. Jack Palder jumping in. Did you watch Washington Gun Laws take on our bloodbath of the election? I did not see that. I bet he did a good job. So, although I don't really know, depending on when you reported on it, you wouldn't have necessarily gotten a sense of where some of these election results went, since after the last million ballots have been counted, 1.1 or something like that, since last week, things have changed a little bit. Let's see. That makes no sense that there was such a large undervote in the Kent case. Need investigation. Perhaps. I mean, I'm going to look at that closely, because for anybody who cares about political science, we're going to want to see what's going on there. TZ Burton, I don't think voting for Republican in Western Washington matters. Every city in King County, Seattle area is a Democrat mayor and city council. Well, that's just not true, though, in areas like Lewis County or Cowlitz County or Pacific or Grays Harbor, parts of Skagit, northern Whatcom, eastern King. I mean, there's a bunch of these places where that's just not true. So even in Federal Way, for example, I mean, there have been reforms and changes that have happened, and they have elected sane people at times. It still takes some level of effort to make it work, and I think you don't want to totally outsource it to, in some other way. Let's see how many. Let's see, voted, yeah, because they were confused by the wording. Yeah, Mr. Hammond, you're not alone. He intentionally made him confusing on the ballot. Yes, he did. Let's see. And Garama Crafts. I'm tuning in a little late, but my question is, did the number of people that signed those initiatives compare to the number of people that voted for them? Oh, that's a good question. Generally, I haven't seen it. I'll have to go back and look at it. You're looking at a cumulative total of about 1.3 million people who signed some of those initiatives, one or more of them. And I believe that you're there on the election, the number of people who voted for them, but I'm not 100% positive. I'll have to go back and look. Maybe not everyone. So I need to go back and look at what those results are. That's a great question. Let's see. If Republicans, Deanne Sanderson, here's another question. If Republicans are pulled from Senate or other seats to join the Trump administration, are their replacements appointed or are there special elections? Well, it's actually both. They're appointed and then there's a special election. So that's usually what happens. They're appointed so they can fill the role until the next special election is scheduled. There might be differences in some states. In our state, if you're appointed any time from now until really any time in the next 6 months, you would be then on the November election in 2025. That's typically what you would do. Let's see. Just came in. How did the initiatives lose? Well, you missed it earlier. I had a long talk about that. Let's see. Leonard Goodman, could you use some new inbox podcasting equipment for free? Yes, I could. I could use anything that I can get. I'm essentially a charity case out here doing the best I can. So if you have anything like that you want to get to me, just find a way to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to see what you have, if that's what you're referring to. So listen, guys, I'm running out of time. I got this voter integrity conference call that I have to jump on right after this. Great questions today. I tried to do my best to get to as many of them as I can. Just remember that there's a lot going on. I'll have videos that should be launching later on this week of a more thorough and detailed breakdown of some of the election results and what they mean around the state, looking at the 2 congressional races, some of which we discussed tonight, the statewide issues, the initiatives, control the legislature, and a little bit other details that kind of, I hope, put some of that stuff in context a little bit better than I've been able to do in a live stream like this. But I do anticipate that we can have more conversations on the subject moving forward. I will be doing, again, my live stream every week as much as I can. I'm trying to stick to these Tuesday nights if I can get it. The only time I won't be able to do that is if I'm doing a speaking engagement somewhere else or I'm not around. I do want to encourage people, if you've got a group of people where you live and you want to make a difference, start to get organized, get together, agree that you basically want to change things in your community. Reach out to me. I'll help you get organized and get the ball on the road, help you move forward, hopefully in advancing those issues. But that's it. Don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button if you haven't already. I appreciate that. It helps just boost our visibility a little bit more, especially if you share these videos with others. You can go down in the video section down below in the description. It'll give you a way if you want to support my channel or my efforts moving forward. Feel free to do that financially, but otherwise just share it with other people. Trying to advance liberty and freedom is not simple or easy, and it It doesn't happen overnight, but I think the more of us that do it, the better off we are, and more likely it is that we can achieve that goal in the end. So thanks for all your questions tonight. Look forward to basically seeing you next week, and hope all's well, and we'll see you then, and if I might see you in the meantime if you're at one of these events. So go and remember that the future does belong to those who show up, and you got to show up and keep making a difference. If you don't show up and you don't try, then failure is certain. So that's the best we can do. A lot of good things going on out there. I don't know about you, but I have family issues. I went and watched my son run at his last state cross-country meet in Pasco on Saturday, and I'm going to watch my daughter compete at state in swimming in Federal Way that's coming up Friday. I'm excited about that. Those are the things that make a big difference in our lives if we can go and see those things. So be involved in your community and your family, and don't forget them, and support your neighbors as well. There's tough times coming up for many of us. We know that, and our country faces great peril and change and challenges. Even if an election goes your way, that helps, but you got other things that we have to deal with, I think, around the world that matter quite a bit. So hope all's well. We'll see you next time. Thank you guys for watching.